Ethan Williams was the kind of man who had everything: wealth, charm, intelligence, and a heart that, despite his fortune, remained humble and kind. He had inherited a massive estate from his late parents, a sprawling mansion surrounded by gardens that looked like something out of a fairy tale. But what truly made people talk was not his fortune. It was his fiancée, Victoria Blake. Victoria was beautiful, the kind of beauty that demanded attention wherever she went. But behind that perfect face and dazzling smile hid a soul filled with arrogance and cruelty. She looked down on anyone she considered beneath her, especially the staff who worked tirelessly in Ethan's mansion. The maids, gardeners, cooks. No one was safe from her sharp tongue and her constant need to humiliate others just to feel superior. Ethan, blinded by love and loyalty, often ignored the signs. He believed Victoria would eventually change. After all, they were about to get married, but fate had other plans. One morning, a new housekeeper arrived at the mansion, a young woman named Isabella Torres. She was a stunning brunette, with warm eyes that seemed to hold both strength and sadness. She wasn't like the others. She carried herself with quiet dignity, no matter how simple her clothes or humble her position. From the first day, Victoria disliked her. Maybe it was Isabella's beauty, or maybe it was the calm kindness she radiated, something Victoria lacked completely. Ethan, on the other hand, couldn't help but notice Isabella's grace and her genuine warmth. She spoke to everyone with respect, always smiling, always doing her work with care. Days passed, and Ethan found himself drawn to small moments. The way Isabella laughed with the gardener, how she stopped to feed the stray cats outside the mansion, how she always greeted him with kindness, never flustered or fake. It wasn't love at first sight, but something deeper, something he couldn't explain. Victoria noticed, and jealousy began to poison her heart. One evening, as Ethan hosted a small dinner for close friends, Victoria watched from afar as Ethan smiled while Isabella served the guests. That gentle smile, the one he rarely gave anymore, wasn't for her. It was for the maid. That night, consumed by anger, Victoria came up with a cruel plan. She would destroy Isabella, make her suffer in front of everyone. The next morning, Victoria sneaked into Ethan's mother's private room, a place filled with priceless heirlooms and jewelry that had been in the family for generations. From a velvet box, she took a diamond necklace, one that Ethan's mother had treasured dearly. Then, under the cover of night, she went to the backyard garden, dug a small hole near the rose bushes, and buried the necklace deep in the dirt. The trap was set. A few days later, Ethan invited some friends and relatives for a weekend barbecue at the mansion. The sun was shining, laughter filled the air, and everyone seemed at ease. That's when Victoria made her move. Pretending to be shocked, she gasped loudly and shouted for everyone to gather around. "I saw something terrible," she cried dramatically. "That new maid, Isabella. I saw her burying something behind the garden." Everyone froze. Isabella turned pale, her heart pounding in confusion. Ethan looked at her, disbelief clouding his eyes. "Is that true?" he asked softly. Victoria pointed toward the garden. "If you don't believe me, go see for yourself. I saw her, with my own eyes, hiding something valuable there." The group followed Victoria to the garden. The air grew tense, the laughter gone. Victoria, smiling wickedly, handed Isabella a small shovel. "Dig," she ordered. Isabella's hands trembled. "Miss, I swear I didn't do anything." "Then you have nothing to fear," Victoria interrupted coldly. Ethan said nothing, torn between confusion and disappointment. Finally, as the crowd watched, Isabella knelt in the dirt, her tears mixed with the soil as she dug slowly, her soft hands trembling with humiliation. After a few moments, the shovel hit something hard. Victoria's eyes gleamed. "There!" she exclaimed. "Pull it out!" Isabella froze, realizing what was happening, the cruel trap she had fallen into. Victoria smirked, her voice sharp and full of venom. "No, don't use your hands," she said coldly. "Since you like to hide things in the dirt, use your mouth to take it out." The crowd gasped in shock. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but she obeyed. Trembling, she leaned forward and pulled the muddy jewelry out with her lips. The humiliation was unbearable. Ethan's face went pale. He felt something twist inside him. Anger, guilt, shame, but he couldn't find words. Isabella stood there, covered in mud and tears, her dignity crushed. As Victoria smiled in triumph, the diamond necklace glittered faintly under the sun, dirty but unmistakably real. Ethan dismissed Isabella immediately, too blinded by the situation to see the truth. She left the mansion in silence, her heart shattered, her innocence taken by lies. But what Victoria didn't know was that truth always finds its way out. Days turned into weeks, but peace never returned to Ethan's mansion. Something inside him had broken that day, not just his trust in Isabella, but also his sense of judgment. The image of her tear-stained face, kneeling in the dirt, haunted him every night. He tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing. She stole. She betrayed my trust, he repeated silently. But every time he remembered her trembling voice saying, "I didn't do anything, sir," guilt gnawed at his heart like a slow-burning fire. Victoria, on the other hand, was radiant. She walked through the mansion like a queen who had just conquered her throne. She had gotten what she wanted. Isabella was gone, humiliated and disgraced, and Ethan was hers again. But even in victory, there was something dark behind her smile. It was the kind of satisfaction that only the wicked understand. A cold, empty triumph built on cruelty. One night, while Ethan was in his study, Victoria entered the room wearing a silk gown, holding 2 glasses of wine. "To new beginnings," she said sweetly, handing him a glass. Ethan forced a smile. Yes, new beginnings. But deep inside, he felt a growing distance, an invisible wall between them. He had once admired Victoria's confidence, but now he saw arrogance. He had once found her passion charming, but now he felt the poison of her pride. As the days passed, small cracks began to appear. The staff, still shaken by what had happened to Isabella, grew fearful of Victoria. They avoided her eyes, spoke only when necessary, and whispered among themselves when she wasn't around. Ethan started noticing things. The way Victoria spoke to people with contempt, how she laughed when others made mistakes, how she seemed to feed off humiliation. Then came the day that would change everything. Ethan was in his mother's old study, going through some family documents when he noticed something strange. A key, small and golden, had fallen behind a bookcase. Curious, he retrieved it and recognized it immediately. It belonged to the jewelry box where his mother's most precious heirlooms were kept, the same box from which the diamond necklace had been taken. Something felt off. He remembered locking that box weeks ago. Why was the key behind a bookcase? Driven by instinct, he went to his mother's room and opened the jewelry box. Inside, everything seemed in order, except for one thing. There were faint traces of dirt near the hinges, as if someone had opened it with soiled hands. A cold wave of realization hit him. He called one of the maids, Mrs. Turner, an older woman who had worked for his family since he was a child. She was trembling when she entered, afraid to say the wrong thing. "Mrs. Turner," Ethan asked softly, "I need the truth. The day Isabella was accused, did you see anything unusual?" Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. She hesitated for a moment, then whispered, "Sir, please don't tell Miss Blake I said this, but I saw her that night. She was in the garden long after everyone had gone to bed. She had dirt on her hands. I thought it was strange, but I didn't dare ask." Ethan's heart stopped. The truth hit him like a storm. He dismissed Mrs. Turner gently and sat down, his head spinning. Everything made sense now. The timing, the confidence with which Victoria had accused Isabella. Even the cruel demand for her to dig the necklace out with her mouth. It wasn't justice. It was vengeance. Ethan clenched his fists, anger rising in his chest. He had allowed an innocent woman to be humiliated, all because he had been too blind to see the truth. But he wasn't going to stay blind any longer. The next weekend, Ethan invited Victoria and a few close friends to another barbecue. The same setting, the same cheerful laughter. But this time, he had a plan. Victoria was radiant as always, showing off her jewelry and smiling proudly at her guests. She had no idea what was coming. After lunch, Ethan stood up and raised his glass. "Before we finish," he said calmly, "there's something I need to address. Something that has haunted this house for weeks." The crowd fell silent. Victoria's smile wavered. "You all remember what happened here?" Ethan continued. "When a woman was accused of stealing something precious from my family." Victoria shifted uncomfortably. "Darling, must we bring that up again? It's over." "No," Ethan interrupted firmly. "It's not over, because I discovered something shocking. The woman we all condemned was innocent." Gasps filled the air. Victoria froze. Ethan turned toward her slowly. "The real thief was you, Victoria." Color drained from her face. What are you talking about? That's ridiculous." Ethan walked closer, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. The key to the jewelry box was found hidden in your room. Dirt on the hinges. Mrs. Turner saw you. In the garden the night before the barbecue. You buried the necklace to frame Isabella. The guests murmured in disbelief. Victoria shook her head frantically. You're lying. You're trying to humiliate me. No, Ethan said coldly. I'm giving you a chance to confess. When she refused, he turned to the gardener. Please bring the small shovel from the shed. Victoria's eyes widened in terror. What are you doing? Ethan didn't answer. When the shovel arrived, he handed it to her. Go to the same spot where you buried my mother's necklace, he ordered. And this time, you'll dig it up yourself. Victoria trembled, her pride collapsing. Ethan, please, don't do this. Not in front of everyone. But Ethan's expression didn't soften. You made an innocent woman humiliate herself before all of us. Now it's your turn. Tears streamed down Victoria's face as she knelt in the dirt. Her expensive dress was ruined, her makeup smeared. The same crowd that had once admired her now watched in silence, the same way they had watched Isabella suffer. When the shovel hit the box, Ethan's voice cut through the air. No hands, he said quietly. You made her use her mouth. So will you. Victoria gasped. Ethan, please, don't make me do this. Do it, he said firmly. The silence was suffocating. Slowly, trembling, she bent down and pulled the box out with her mouth, just as Isabella had done. The humiliation was complete. Her tears mixed with the mud, her pride shattered beyond repair. When she stood shaking and sobbing, Ethan took the box from her hands. You destroyed a good woman's life because of jealousy. You don't deserve forgiveness. He turned to the guests. Let everyone here witness this. Evil can wear the face of beauty, but truth always reveals the heart. Then, with cold finality, he looked at Victoria one last time. We're done. Leave my house. Later that night, police arrived. Victoria was arrested for theft and slander. Weeks later, Ethan found Isabella. Again, she was working quietly in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, her spirit dimmed but not broken. When she saw him, she froze, unsure whether to run or cry. I came to apologize, he said softly. I was blind, and I hurt you in ways I'll never forgive myself for. Tears filled her eyes. Why are you here? Because I don't want to live another day without asking for your forgiveness. And because I realized something. You were the only one who ever treated me like a man, not like a millionaire. For a moment silence hung between them. Then Isabella smiled gently, the first true smile he had seen in months. Forgiveness took time, but love grew slowly, like sunlight after a storm. Months later, the mansion that had once been filled with arrogance and cruelty was filled with laughter again. The staff smiled, peace had returned, and Isabella, now Mrs. Williams, walked through the halls with grace, not pride. And whenever people asked Ethan how he had known she was the one, he always said the same thing. Because when everyone else wanted my fortune, she was the only one who saw my heart. Months had passed since that unforgettable day when truth shattered lies and justice was finally served. But even as peace returned to the mansion, the echoes of the past still lingered, like faint shadows that refused to fade. Ethan Williams, once known for his wealth and charisma, had learned a lesson that no amount of money could ever teach, that kindness and humility were far rarer treasures than gold. The world had not forgotten what happened. Newspapers and society columns spoke endlessly about the scandal of Victoria Blake, the elegant fiancée of the young millionaire who had been arrested for theft and deceit. Once adored for her beauty and charm, she had become the subject of shame and pity. The mighty had fallen, and the world had watched. Ethan, however, had no satisfaction in her downfall. What haunted him was not revenge, but remorse. He thought of Isabella every day, her quiet grace, her trembling voice when she had pleaded for him to believe her, and her tears mixing with the dirt as she was forced to endure humiliation that she didn't deserve. He knew that no apology could ever erase that pain. One evening, as he sat in his study, the house silent and cold, Ethan looked at an old photograph of his parents. His mother's kind eyes seemed to look right through him, and for the first time in a long while he whispered, I failed, Mother. I let pride blind me. I let someone innocent suffer. He decided that very night to find Isabella, not to offer her money, not to ease his own guilt, but to make things right in the only way he could, through truth, humility, and love. It took weeks of searching before he finally found her in a small town far from the city, working at a quiet cafe tucked away on a corner where the scent of freshly baked bread drifted through the morning air. She looked different, calmer, more at peace, but there was still a shadow of sadness in her eyes. When Ethan entered the cafe, her hands froze mid-motion. For a moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. He was the last person she ever expected to see again. "Isabella," he said softly, removing his hat. "I didn't come here as the man you once worked for. I came here as a man who owes you everything." The cafe fell silent. The few customers turned to watch as Ethan approached the counter. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "People will talk. They'll think. I don't care what people think anymore." Ethan interrupted gently. "I've spent months caring about appearances, wealth, reputation, and it only led me to misery. I came here because I owe you something far more important than an apology." Her eyes shimmered with emotion. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Williams. The past is the past." He shook his head. "No, the past will only be the past when the truth has healed, and I don't want to move forward without you knowing how deeply sorry I am. I was blind, Isabella, blind to what was in front of me. You had more dignity in your silence than most people have in their entire lives." She turned away, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You believed her. You made me dig that necklace out with my mouth in front of everyone. Do you know what that did to me?" Ethan lowered his head, his voice breaking. "Yes, and that's why I'm here, not to erase it because nothing can, but to make sure that, from this day forward, no one ever humiliates you again." Silence hung between them. Then softly, Isabella said, "Forgiveness isn't something that can be bought, Ethan. I'm not asking to buy it," he said. "I'm asking to earn it." And from that moment, a new story began. One built not on wealth or power, but on redemption. A year later, the mansion had changed completely. The air that once carried tension and arrogance was now filled with warmth and laughter. Ethan had rebuilt everything from the ground up, but this time, not for luxury, for meaning. He had transformed one of the guest wings into a foundation dedicated to helping women who had been falsely accused, shamed, or mistreated, just like Isabella. He named it the House of Light. Every room bore an inscription that read, "Truth will always rise, no matter how deep it's buried." The community praised Ethan's new mission, but the ones who admired him most were those he had helped, people who saw the sincerity in his eyes, the change in his soul. And standing beside him, guiding the foundation with grace and quiet strength, was Isabella. At first, she had been hesitant to return. The memories of her humiliation were still painful, and the mansion itself was a reminder of betrayal. But Ethan had asked her not to return as a servant, but as a partner in something greater. Together, they worked tirelessly. Isabella became a voice for the voiceless, strong, compassionate, and wise. And slowly, the walls of her heart, which had been built from pain and distrust, began to soften. One evening, as they stood by the garden, the same garden where her tears had once fallen into the soil, Ethan turned to her and said, "Do you believe that beauty can grow from pain?" She looked at the blooming roses, the same spot where the necklace had been buried. "Yes," she said softly, "because even the ugliest soil can give birth to something pure." Ethan smiled, his heart full. "Then let this place be proof of that." He reached into his pocket and took out a small box. Not a luxurious diamond, not something glittering or grand, but a simple silver ring adorned with a tiny sapphire, the color of the sky after rain. "I don't want to give you a symbol of wealth," he said. "I want to give you a symbol of truth, something pure, like your heart." Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she covered her mouth in shock. "Ethan, He knelt before her, the same way she had once knelt in the dirt. But this time, it was not humiliation. It was love, humility, and redemption. "Will you marry me?" he asked softly. Her lips trembled. She looked into his eyes, not the eyes of a rich man, but of a man who had finally learned the meaning of compassion. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will." The staff cheered. Even the old gardener wiped away tears. And as they embraced, the evening sun bathed them in golden light, as if heaven itself was smiling upon them. The wedding months later, the grand hall of the Williams estate was filled with music and joy. But unlike the cold, extravagant parties that Victoria once demanded, this was a celebration of love and gratitude. The guests were not nobles or celebrities, but people whose lives had been touched by kindness, workers, families, orphans, and friends who had once stood by Isabella's side when she had nothing. Isabella walked down the aisle wearing a dress as simple as her soul, white chiffon that flowed like light itself. Ethan waited for her at the altar, his eyes glistening with emotion. When she reached him, he took her hands and whispered, "You've turned my mansion into a home, my guilt into hope, and my mistakes into lessons. You've shown me that love isn't about perfection, it's about forgiveness." And with tears in her eyes, Isabella replied, "You taught me that even those who fall can rise again, if their heart truly changes." They exchanged vows under the same sky that had once witnessed their pain, and as they kissed, the guests applauded with genuine joy. It wasn't the wedding of a millionaire and a maid. It was the union of two souls reborn from the ashes of pride and pain. Epilogue. Years later, when people spoke of Ethan and Isabella Williams, they no longer talked about scandal or wealth. They spoke of compassion, second chances, and the strange, beautiful ways that destiny brings light from darkness. Children played in the mansion gardens, flowers bloomed where tears once fell, and the story of the millionaire and the maid became a lesson told to every guest who visited their home. Because in the end, the richest man is not the one who owns the most, but the one who learns to love, to forgive, and to kneel humbly before the truth. And in that truth, Ethan and Isabella lived, not as a fairy tale, but as living proof that even the cruelest betrayal can lead to the purest redemption. The Grand Williams estate no longer resembled the cold palace it once had been. Gone were the marble statues of pride, the portraits that glorified wealth and lineage. In their place hung paintings of compassion, children laughing, families reunited, women who had once lost everything now standing tall again. The mansion had been transformed into something more beautiful than any architectural wonder, a sanctuary of second chances. Every week, carriages and cars would arrive at its gates carrying people from every corner of the country, women who had been falsely accused, servants dismissed, unfairly, workers who had lost their dignity to the arrogance of those in power. They came not to ask for pity, but for purpose. Isabella personally welcomed many of them. She listened to their stories with the same quiet strength that had once kept her from collapsing when her own world had fallen apart. She had a gift, the ability to look into a person's eyes and make them feel seen. Sometimes she would walk them through the gardens, where the roses now grew thicker than ever, red, white, and gold, and she would say softly, "Once, I was humiliated in this very soil, but God planted forgiveness here instead of hatred. That's why beauty grows." Ethan, now older and wiser, spent his days managing the foundation, called the House of Light. He often visited schools, orphanages, and churches, telling the story of how his own blindness to character nearly destroyed everything he loved. He didn't hide his past. Instead, he used it as a testimony. In one of his speeches, he said, "Wealth is not the measure of greatness. True greatness is admitting when we've been wrong, and having the courage to rebuild what pride has broken." The crowd always applauded, not because of his words, but because they could see the sincerity in his eyes. Victoria's fate. Meanwhile, far away from the golden halls of the Williams estate, Victoria Blake lived a very different life. After her conviction, she spent several years in prison. At first, she raged against everyone, against the justice system, against Ethan, against the world. She couldn't bear to look at herself in the cracked mirror of her cell. Her beauty faded, her arrogance crumbled, and for the first time, she faced something she had never known: solitude. It was during those years that she began to read the Bible that an old prison nurse had given her. At first, she mocked it, but one night when sleep refused to come and guilt gnawed at her heart, she opened it again. She read about Mary Magdalene, the woman judged, condemned, and yet forgiven. Something inside her broke. She began to cry, not the shallow tears of self-pity, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from the core of her soul. From that day on, Victoria changed. Slowly, painfully, she began to rebuild herself. When her sentence ended, she didn't return to high society. She left the city and went to a small convent near the countryside. There she worked as a caregiver for elderly women, washing their clothes, preparing their meals, helping them pray. The sisters said she rarely spoke of her past, but every night she would light a candle and whisper a single prayer. "Forgive me, Isabella. Forgive me, Ethan." And perhaps in some divine way, forgiveness reached her, not through words, but through the quiet mercy of time. The next generation years later, laughter once again echoed through the Williams estate, not from servants or guests, but from children. Ethan and Isabella had two, a boy named Samuel and a girl named Clara. Samuel had his father's intelligence and calm nature, while Clara had her mother's eyes, full of light and empathy. From an early age, they were taught not about wealth, but about humility. Isabella often told them stories before bed, not fairy tales of princes and castles, but real stories about truth and kindness. One night, as the children sat under the stars, Samuel asked, "Mother, is it true that father once thought you were a thief?" The question made Ethan freeze for a moment, but Isabella smiled gently. "Yes, it's true," she said, "but what matters isn't what people believe about you. What matters is who you are when the truth finally comes." Clara tilted her head. "And what happened to the lady who hurt you?" Isabella looked toward the dark horizon. "She lost everything because she couldn't love, but I hope she found peace." Ethan reached for Isabella's hand and squeezed it. "She taught us something too," he said quietly, "that even those who do wrong can be forgiven, if they truly change." The children didn't fully understand, but they would one day. The return of the necklace. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan prepared a surprise for Isabella. He invited everyone who had ever been part of their story, the staff, the families helped by the foundation, and even Mrs. Turner, now retired but still sharp and cheerful. During the dinner, he stood and raised his glass. "There's one last chapter to close," he said. He held up a small, gleaming object, the same diamond necklace that had once caused so much pain. "I kept this hidden all these years," Ethan said, "not because of its value, but because it reminded me of my greatest failure and my greatest redemption. But tonight, I want to return it where it belongs." He handed the necklace to Isabella. "To you," he said softly, "not as a symbol of wealth, but as a reminder that even in the dirt, truth still shines." Tears welled in her eyes as she fastened it around her neck. "This necklace once buried my dignity," she whispered. "Now it honors it." The guests applauded, but the moment that truly marked the evening came when Isabella stepped up and announced something unexpected. "From this day forward," she said, "every piece of jewelry I own will be auctioned once a year. The money will go to those who need a second chance." That night, the necklace was sold for charity. The same one that had once been used for evil now became a source of hope for hundreds of women. The legacy lives. On years turned into decades. Ethan and Isabella grew old together, walking every morning through the same garden where their story had begun. The roses still bloomed, strong, vibrant, eternal. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Ethan sat on a bench beside Isabella, holding her hand. His hair was gray now, and her face was lined with the marks of time, but their love had only deepened. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Every time the wind passes through the garden, I remember it, but not with pain, with gratitude, because if that day hadn't happened, we wouldn't have become who we are." Ethan looked at her lovingly. "You forgave me when I didn't deserve it. You saw the man I could be when I couldn't even see myself." She squeezed his hand gently. "Love isn't about deserving, Ethan. It's about grace." As the evening light turned golden, they sat together in silence, surrounded by the sound of children playing in the distance and the scent of blooming roses. And when the time finally came for their earthly journey to end, they left behind not just wealth, but a legacy of mercy and truth that continued through generations. A century had passed since Ethan and Isabella Williams walked the earth. Time had carried away their voices, their laughter, their faces, but not their story. Their legacy still pulsed through the veins of the land, through the walls of the mansion that had once witnessed humiliation and redemption. Now, the great estate was no longer a private home. It had become something greater, a historical monument, a place of pilgrimage for those who believed in second chances, forgiveness, and the quiet power of truth. One crisp autumn morning, a young woman named Clara Williams II arrived at the gates of the estate. She was a historian, a writer, and, though she didn't fully understand it yet, the great-great-granddaughter of Ethan and Isabella. Her grandmother had told her fragments of stories when she was a child, a tale of a maid and a millionaire, of betrayal and forgiveness, of love that conquered pride. But so much had been lost to time. The old letters, the journals, the family heirlooms, many were thought to be gone forever. Now, as part of a historical preservation project, Clara had come to restore what remained. When she entered the mansion, she was struck by its stillness. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, painting golden paths across the marble floors. The portraits of Ethan and Isabella hung in the main hall, his gaze gentle, hers radiant, both faces serene. Beneath them, engraved in brass, were the words Ethan had once spoken. Truth will always rise, no matter how deep it's buried. As Clara wandered through the rooms, she could almost feel their presence. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind seemed to carry echoes of their story. That afternoon, while exploring the library, she found something extraordinary. A hidden drawer beneath an old oak desk. Inside lay a small bundle of letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. The ink was pale, the paper fragile, but the first words she read made her heart race. My beloved Isabella, if one day our story is forgotten, I hope someone will find these words and remember that forgiveness is the highest form of love. Her breath caught. The handwriting was unmistakably old-fashioned, but full of grace. It was Ethan's. She turned the pages carefully. There were letters written during their marriage, filled with reflections, prayers, and hopes for the generations to come. But the last one, sealed in wax, was different, marked, "To those who will come after us." Clara broke the seal with trembling hands. To our descendants, you may never meet us, but you live in the garden we planted, not of flowers, but of choices. Remember, every act of cruelty plants thorns. Every act of love plants roots that will outlast empires. Guard your hearts from pride, and may your hands always lift others from the dirt. That is our true inheritance. Tears filled Clara's eyes. She pressed the letter to her chest. It wasn't just history. It was a message from the past, speaking directly to her soul. The restoration of the garden. Outside, the gardens had long grown wild. Their beauty faded with time. The once vibrant roses were tangled in thorns, the fountains dry, the statues worn by the elements. But Clara felt a calling, an almost spiritual pull, to restore them. With the help of volunteers from the House of Light Foundation, which still operated around the world, she began the slow, patient work of renewal. They cleared weeds, rebuilt pathways, and replanted roses in the exact patterns Isabella had once designed: red for pain, white for forgiveness, and gold for rebirth. Every morning, Clara would walk the garden paths, reading Ethan's letters aloud as if his words were blessings spoken to the soil. She believed the land remembered, and perhaps, in some way, it did. By spring, the eternal garden bloomed once more. The scent of roses filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of bees and the song of doves. People began visiting again, not as tourists, but as pilgrims. They came to reflect, to pray, to find hope in the story of two souls who turned humiliation into grace. The forgotten portrait. During the restoration, Clara made another discovery in an unused attic room, a large dust-covered canvas hidden behind old furniture. When she removed the cloth, she gasped. It was a painting of Isabella, but not as the maid, nor as the wealthy wife. She was portrayed standing barefoot in the garden, her dress simple, her face serene, one hand resting over her heart. Behind her, faintly, was Ethan, not beside her, but standing a few steps away, as though humbly watching her strength. At the bottom, the artist had signed the piece, E.W. It was Ethan himself. Clara wept as she realized what it meant. The painting was his final tribute, a confession in colors. He had immortalized the woman who had taught him the meaning of love, not through grandeur, but through humility. The painting was restored and placed in the heart of the mansion. Visitors often stopped before it, sensing the quiet reverence it carried. It became a symbol of love that transcended ego, of two people who had found eternity, not in wealth, but in forgiveness. Victoria's redemption. Remembered one afternoon, while reading through the archives, Clara found a letter written by one of the nuns from the countryside convent. It was addressed to Isabella, though it had never been sent. My dear Mrs. Williams, I cared for a woman who once wronged you deeply. Her name was Victoria Blake. In her final years, she spoke your name with tears, asking for forgiveness every night. She left behind a small silver cross and asked that it be sent to you. though she feared it might never reach your hands. She said it was her reminder that grace can bloom even in the coldest heart. Clara searched through the convent's relics and, miraculously, found the cross. Tarnished but intact, she placed it inside a glass case beside Isabella's restored portrait. Now, visitors could see both symbols side by side, the cross of repentance and the necklace of redemption. One had been born from guilt, the other from grace, and together they told the complete story. The generation of light. Clara's work inspired many. Schools began teaching the Millionaire's lesson not as fiction, but as a true story of transformation. Artists painted, poets wrote, and filmmakers sought to capture the tale. But what mattered most wasn't fame, it was change. In the years that followed, thousands of people who had once been broken, accused, or shamed found strength in the legacy of Ethan and Isabella. The foundation expanded globally, building shelters, schools, and counseling centers. Every branch carried the same motto carved above its entrance: from humility comes healing, from truth comes light. And in Aixiao, the eternal garden, a plaque was added beneath their statues. Clara chose the words herself, quoting from one of Isabella's old journal entries. "If your heart is buried by injustice, remember, God never leaves a seed unfound. Wait, and he will make it bloom." 50 years later, on the centennial of Isabella and Ethan's passing, the Eternal Garden hosted a grand ceremony. Thousands gathered, descendants, volunteers, and strangers alike. The roses were in full bloom, shimmering in the morning light. Clara, now an elderly woman, stood before the statue, holding the original letter Ethan had written to those who would come after. Her voice trembled as she read, "Truth will always rise, no matter how deep it's buried." When she finished, silence filled the air. A silence so profound it felt holy. Then, as if on cue, a soft breeze swept through the garden, scattering petals across the crowd. The sky glowed golden. Children ran laughing through the roses. The world seemed, for that moment, utterly at peace. And Clara looked toward the heavens and whispered, "They're still here." Because some stories never end. They take root in the hearts of those who remember. The mansion stood as it always had, but its spirit was alive in every act of kindness, every forgiveness offered, every truth finally spoken. Epilogue. The lesson that never dies. Centuries later, when historians study the Williams family, they don't focus on their fortune or fame. They study their transformation, how a moment of cruelty became the foundation for compassion that spanned generations. They say the Eternal Garden still blooms all year round, even when the winter snows fall heavy. And those who walk through it claim they can sometimes hear faint laughter, the sound of a man and a woman walking side by side, hand in hand, at peace. And engraved at the gates of the garden, now visited by millions each year, are the final words of their shared story. Love once buried will never die, for even now, in the darkest soil, truth remembers the light. Centuries had passed since the days of Ethan and Isabella Williams. Empires had risen and fallen, languages had evolved, and cities had grown into luminous towers that kissed the edge of the heavens. Technology had reshaped the world beyond imagination, yet amidst the pulse of machines and the hum of artificial stars, the Eternal Garden still stood, a relic of an age when love, betrayal, and forgiveness were the most powerful forces known to humankind. The world now called it Sanctuary Alpha. To the masses, it was merely a preserved historical site, a monument protected by the Global Heritage Network. But to a few who still believed in the sacred mysteries of the heart, the Eternal Garden was something more, a living portal to the past, a bridge between the souls of those who had loved and those who had yet to learn how. The awakening of a forgotten name. In the year 3028, a young woman named Ilara Williams arrived in the capital, city of New Avalon. She was a scientist, brilliant and skeptical, a woman of logic in an age of artificial faiths. She had been raised on the outer colonies, where the concept of God was as outdated as paper books. Her work centered on memory preservation, the study of neural echoes and digital consciousness. Her mission was to map the human soul, to discover whether emotions could survive beyond death as data. But fate had its own designs. One evening, while researching ancient archives, Ilara came across a restricted file labeled simply the Williams Lineage Project. Intrigued by the name, her own name, she accessed it through an encrypted key. The screen flickered, and a centuries-old video began to play. It showed a woman reading from a letter, her voice trembling with emotion. Behind her, a sea of roses shimmered beneath golden sunlight. Truth will always rise, no matter how deep it's buried. Alara froze. She had heard those words before. Her grandmother, a quiet woman, who had died when Alara was 10, used to whisper them every night before sleep. "They're our family's words," she had said. "Never forget them." And now, here they were, spoken by a woman who looked hauntingly like her. Alara scrolled further through the archive and found thousands of documents, images, and restored recordings, all connected to the same story, the Millionaire's lesson. She read of Ethan and Isabella, of betrayal and redemption, of a love that had rewritten the destiny of generations. The deeper she read, the more she felt an inexplicable ache, as if something ancient and forgotten within her was calling out to be remembered. By dawn, she knew what she had to do. She would find the eternal garden, journey to the forgotten sanctuary. The eternal garden was hidden deep within what had once been the old Earth, now a preserved biosphere known as Terra 9, accessible only through government clearance. Nature had reclaimed most of the planet's surface, but the old mansion, the House of Williams, still stood, protected under a dome of translucent energy. When Alara finally arrived, she was stunned. Time had not destroyed it. The garden glowed beneath the shielded sky, alive with roses that defied extinction. Each petal shimmered faintly, as though absorbing the light from unseen stars. The air was still, sacred. A caretaker drone approached her. "Welcome, Dr. Williams," it said in a soft, human-like voice. "You have arrived at Sanctuary Alpha. Would you like to access the ancestral archive?" Alara nodded silently. The drone led her into the mansion, where holographic projections of old portraits came to life around her. Ethan and Isabella, Clara, and countless others. It was as if their spirits had been waiting for her return. At the center of the grand hall stood a pedestal. Upon it, encased in protective glass, was a single golden rose. "This," the drone explained, "is the rose of redemption. It was said to have been planted by Isabella Williams herself. Its genetic code has been preserved and replicated throughout centuries as a symbol of rebirth." Alara leaned closer, studying the delicate petals. They seemed impossibly alive, pulsing faintly as though breathing. Her scientific mind raced with questions. How could a flower live for 1,000 years? What secret had kept it so pure? She reached out her hand toward the glass, and in that instant, the rose bloomed brighter, the air thick with a scent that felt strangely familiar. For a heartbeat, Alara heard a whisper in her mind. "The truth, my child, has been waiting for you." She stumbled back, her pulse racing. It couldn't be real. There was no such thing as voices from the dead. Yet the echo lingered, warm and sorrowful, like the memory of a dream. The revelation. That night, Alara stayed inside the mansion, poring over every document, every artifact. She found Ethan's journals preserved in digital format, entries written in elegant Old English, describing his life after the great scandal, his charity work, his marriage to Isabella, and their final days together. One entry stood out. "If love can cross one lifetime, perhaps it can cross 1,000. And if our story ever reaches the ears of one who carries our name, may it awaken what even time cannot erase." Alara closed her eyes. She could almost feel his voice within her, steady, wise, loving. And then she found Isabella's writings, letters written not to Ethan, but to the future. "To the daughter of my daughter's daughter, who will walk in an age of metal and stars. You will be lost in knowledge, but you must find your way back to wonder. Remember, truth does not exist in data or in machines, but in the human heart that dares to feel." The letters felt impossibly personal, as though written for her. Alara realized with a chill, Isabella had somehow foreseen her. But the final message was what shattered her heart. "If you ever doubt the power of love, go to the garden. At dawn, the rose will know you. It will show you the truth, the miracle of dawn." The next morning, Alara walked barefoot through the garden as the artificial sun began to rise. The air shimmered, and dew glistened like diamonds across the petals. She stopped before the golden rose, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she began to cry. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I've spent my life chasing the science of memory, but you remembered me before I was even born." A soft wind stirred. The petals of the rose unfolded one by one, revealing a small glowing crystal embedded within its heart. The caretaker drone appeared beside her. "This is the heart of the rose," it said. "It contains the genetic memory of the garden and the recorded neural patterns of its original caretakers." Ilara's hands trembled. "Their consciousnesses, fragments," the drone replied. "Echoes of Ethan and Isabella Williams, preserved not by technology, but by resonance, an energy we have never seen." Fully understood, Ilara placed her hand over the crystal. The world dissolved around her. Suddenly she was standing in a vision of the past. The old world, vibrant and alive. The mansion was new, the sky blue and endless. She saw Ethan and Isabella walking through the roses, hand in hand, smiling softly. Isabella turned, her eyes meeting Ilara's. "You found us," she said gently. "The seed of our love still blooms, because you remembered." Ilara fell to her knees, overwhelmed. "You're real." "You're alive in here." "Not alive," Ethan said, his voice warm and deep, "but remembered. And remembrance, my dear, is the truest form of life. The world you live in," Isabella added, "has forgotten how to feel. But you came back to the garden. You listened. That means the light still survives." Tears streamed down Ilara's face. "What do I do now?" "Take the rose," Isabella said. "Plant it again, beyond this dome, beyond this world. Let it remind humanity of what it means to forgive, to hope, to love." The vision began to fade, their voices echoing softly. "Truth will always rise, no matter how deep it's buried." Ilara awoke in the garden, the golden rose glowing brighter than ever. Inside its petals, the crystal pulsed like a heartbeat. With trembling hands, she removed it and placed it in a containment pod. That night, she boarded her ship and left Terra 9, carrying the last living remnant of the Williams legacy into the stars. Decades passed, and humanity spread across countless worlds. On a distant planet called Eden Nova, Ilara fulfilled her promise. She planted the rose in fertile soil beneath a sky of twin suns, and it grew. Within months, an entire field of golden roses blanketed the valley, their light visible from orbit. People from every corner of the galaxy came to see them, calling the place the Valley of Forgiveness. And there, beneath the twin suns, stood a marble statue of Ethan and Isabella, his hand resting over hers, both smiling toward you. Eternity. At the base of the monument were the words Ilara had chosen to honor them. "Love is not a relic of the past. It is the seed of every new beginning." Generations later, children on distant worlds would learn of the Millionaire's lesson not as history, but as legend. The story of a man who learned humility, a woman who taught forgiveness, and a love that transcended death and time. The eternal garden on earth became the first sanctuary, while the golden valley on Eden Nova became the second garden. Between them stretched a bridge of memory, unbreakable, eternal. And though the stars would one day fade, the roses would continue to bloom, because love, once planted, can never truly die. And even among the galaxies, the whisper of Ethan and Isabella's vow could still be heard. Truth will always rise, no matter how deep it's buried. Love will always bloom, no matter how far it's carried. Millennia passed. Stars that had once burned bright across the velvet of creation began to fade. Entire civilizations rose, reached for eternity, and fell again into dust. Planets that had once teemed with life now lay silent under the cold breath of dying suns. Humanity had spread far beyond the cradle of Earth, far beyond Eden Nova. And yet, as the centuries turned to ages, memory began to fracture. Words once sacred turned to myths, myths to whispers, whispers to nothing. But not everything was lost. Somewhere in the dark edge of the galaxy, where light itself seemed afraid to linger, a small forgotten world revolved around a pale and dying star. The planet was called Lunaris, though few remembered why. Its skies were forever dim, and its surface was a wasteland of silver ash and frozen winds. Yet in the midst of that desolation stood a dome of cracked glass and ancient machinery, a remnant of a time when hope had dared to build even in the face of oblivion. Inside it lay the archive of life, humanity's final sanctuary of memory. And within that archive, guarded by the silent hum of forgotten machines, slept the last golden seed, the child of dust. Her name was Lyra, She was 13 years old, small and fierce, with eyes the color of dying stars. She had never seen sunlight. The sky above Lunaris was a constant twilight, a dim mirror reflecting the sorrow of a universe nearing its end. Her people, the last generation of human wanderers, lived in scattered colonies beneath the surface, surviving on recycled air and the fading energy of old reactors. They told no stories, sang no songs. Hope had become a foreign word, replaced by endurance. But Lyra was different. From a young age, she had been drawn to the surface, to the old ruins forbidden by the elders. They said the world above was cursed, haunted by ghosts of a forgotten age. But when Lyra looked at the faint lights flickering in the distance, the remains of the ancient dome, she didn't feel fear. She felt calling. Something deep in her bones whispered that there was something waiting for her there, something that belonged to her, though she couldn't explain why. The Discovery one stormless night, when the winds were quiet and the temperature rose just enough for survival, Lyra stole a mask, a ration pack, and a small energy lamp. She climbed the surface tunnels until the world opened before her, an endless desert of silver dust under a cracked violet sky. The dome was closer than she'd imagined, half buried, half collapsed. It loomed like the skeleton of a giant beast. As she stepped inside, the ancient systems flickered weakly to life. Blue lights danced across the walls. Dust motes floated like stars. Lyra wandered between the relics, broken consoles, sealed containers, and faded holograms of faces she couldn't recognize. Words in an old tongue scrolled across cracked screens. Project Eden Archive, Sectors 03A. And then she saw it. At the center of the chamber, protected by layers of transparent casing, was a small pod. Inside it glowed a faint light, soft and golden, pulsing like a heartbeat. Lyra pressed her hand against the glass. "Hello?" she whispered, as if expecting an answer. The pod responded. The chamber lights brightened, systems rebooted, and a gentle voice, feminine, calm, ancient, filled the air. Identity scan, incomplete, unknown user, genetic match, 0.01% recognized, lineage detected, Williams. Lyra gasped. "Williams? What's that?" The voice continued. "Welcome, descendant of the founders. You have come for the last seed." A section of the casing unfolded, revealing the object within. A single, luminous golden seed, small enough to rest in her palm. "This seed," the voice explained, "contains the genetic and spiritual essence of the Rosa Aeternum, the eternal rose. It was carried across the stars by Alara Williams, preserved through centuries of decay, awaiting the one who would awaken the light once more." Lyra stared, entranced. "But why me?" "Because," the voice said softly, "you still believe. The awakening." Lyra spent the following days returning to the dome, studying everything she could. The archive contained old recordings, fragments of history, broken but beautiful. She saw the faces of people long gone, Ethan and Isabella walking through the first garden, Alara planting the rose beneath twin suns, children laughing among fields of gold. Each vision filled her with wonder and pain. How had such a world existed? How had humanity fallen so far? She began to understand that the seed wasn't just a relic. It was a symbol, the embodiment of everything humans had once been capable of: love, forgiveness, creation, and rebirth. But the dome's systems warned her. Power failure imminent. Atmospheric collapse predicted within one lunar cycle. If she didn't act soon, the last seed, and all the memories it carried, would be lost forever. Lyra made a choice. She would plant the seed, not in the dead soil of the dome, but beneath the open sky, to give it one last chance to live, even if it meant her death. The planting. The next night, Lyra climbed to the highest ridge overlooking the wasteland. She dug through the frozen ground with bare hands until her fingers bled. The earth was hard, unyielding, but she whispered to it stories she had learned from the archive. She told the ground about Ethan and Isabella, about love stronger than pride. She spoke of Alara, who carried hope beyond the stars, and when she placed the golden seed into the hole, she whispered, "Grow, even if I never see you." The winds howled, the ground trembled faintly. For a moment, nothing happened, and then, a spark, a faint golden shimmer radiated from the soil, spreading like veins of light. Lyra gasped as the dust began to glow. the warmth touching her face. She fell to her knees, crying and laughing all at once. But the air was thinning. Her oxygen mask was failing. The winds picked up again, fierce and cold. As her vision dimmed, she thought she saw something, a stem breaking through the dirt, a single petal unfurling like sunrise. And then everything went dark. Centuries passed. The last humans of Lunaris vanished into legend. The planet drifted silently through the void, abandoned, forgotten. Until one day, long after the death of its sun, a ship from a distant civilization detected a faint, impossible signal, a pulse of energy unlike any other. They followed it to the ruined planet. What they found defied all understanding. Where once there had been ash and ruin, now stood a forest of golden light, trees of radiant glass, rivers of shimmering energy, and at the heart of it all, a single colossal rose, its petals glowing with the warmth of a newborn star. From its core emanated a field of energy so strong that it reignited the dead sun, bathing Lunaris once more in light. And within the rose, preserved like an angel in crystal, lay the body of a child, untouched by time, her face serene. Lyra Williams. The explorers built a city around the rose, calling it Nova Veritas, the new truth. Scholars and mystics alike studied the energy it radiated, unable to explain how life had returned to a planet long dead. They discovered that the rose contained within it the genetic code of all life once known, human, animal, and plant alike, preserved and reborn through the consciousness of the girl who had planted it. Lyra had become one with the seed, and her whispered words, recorded in the core, became the creed of a new civilization. Even when the stars go dark, love remembers the way home. Thousands of years later, when Nova Veritas had grown into the heart of a new galaxy-spanning society, children were still taught the ancient story of the millionaire and the maid, not as myth, but as sacred history, the story of the first seed, the eternal rose, and the souls who refused to let truth die. On the anniversary of the awakening, pilgrims would gather beneath the great rose, now taller than mountains, its petals glowing like suns. The air would shimmer with warmth, and they would hear, faintly, softly, a voice carried by the wind. It was not the voice of Lyra alone. It was the echo of every heart that had ever believed. Ethan, Isabella, Alara, and the countless souls who had lived and loved through the ages. And together, their words resounded across the stars. Truth will always rise, no matter how deep it's buried. Love will always bloom, no matter how far it's carried. And from the last seed, life will always begin again. Thousands of years later, when Nova Veritas had grown into the heart of a new galaxy-spanning society, children were still taught the ancient story of the millionaire and the maid, not as myth, but as sacred history. The story of the first seed, the eternal rose, and the souls who refused to let truth die. On the anniversary of the awakening, pilgrims would gather beneath the great rose, now taller than mountains, its petals glowing like suns. The air would shimmer with warmth, and they would hear, faintly, softly, a voice carried by the wind. It was not the voice of Lyra alone. It was the echo of every heart that had ever believed. Ethan, Isabella, Alara, and the countless souls who had lived and loved through the ages. And together, their words resounded across the stars. Truth will always rise, no matter how deep it's buried. Love will always bloom, no matter how far it's carried. And from the last seed, life will always begin again. Billions of years later, the galaxy itself began to fade. Even the great rose, now a celestial monument visible from light years away, began to transform. Its petals broke apart, scattering across the void, not dying, but becoming stars. Each petal birthed a new world, a new sun, a new beginning. And so the legacy of the Williams family became the foundation of a new universe, a cycle without end, where love and truth were no longer fleeting emotions, but the very laws that governed creation itself. And somewhere, in that infinite garden of stars, a whisper continued to echo. From humility came forgiveness. From forgiveness came love. From love came life eternal.